Hi guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome to another video. So, with it being the 4th of May, which is kind of unofficially the celebration of Star Wars Day, I thought I would give you a ranking of all of the live action Star Wars films. Yeah, Star Wars has been a massive part of my life for as far back as I can remember. I love the series of films, love the franchise, and yeah, it's just very special to me. And it's great that we have days like this to celebrate such an iconic franchise. But yeah, I'm going to give you a ranking of all of the live action films. So I'm not going to include any of the animated films or any of the TV shows or anything like that. It's just going to be the live action theatrical films. So that's the 9 Skywalker films and the 2 anthology films that we got in between. So yeah, with all that being said, let's get into the ranking. So, in dead last, in 11th place, I'm going to have to go with Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. So yeah, this is the last film in the Skywalker saga currently, the last film in the sequel trilogy. And yeah, I'm just going to touch very briefly on the film that preceded this, which was The Last Jedi. A film that, I think it's fair to say, alienated a lot of the fans. I think it was a very radical film. But I feel like when they got to this film, I feel like the producers kind of bottled it a little bit, and trying to appease the fans, I feel like they tried to reset everything in this movie, and in doing so, this movie just comes out a complete mess, in my opinion. This Star Wars film lacks any sort of logic, and things happen in this movie without any sort of explanation. Why is the Empire still alive? Why does he have this army of Star Destroyers that just appear out of nowhere in the last battle of the film? There's just so many things in this movie that don't make sense, and I think it just comes down to poor writing and just this wanting from the producers to just try and appease the fans and get them back in their good books after the previous film was a bit of a radical departure for a lot of people. But it's just a mess of a film. By this point, we're pretty much just concentrated on the character of Rey, who for me is probably one of the most bland, unoriginal characters in the whole Star Wars universe. She is basically just a Luke Skywalker clone. And yeah, by this point in the sequel trilogy, I'm already tapped out. And yeah, I just think this film is so poor, so badly written, badly directed. It looks fine. It's sort of, it's got some decent action scenes, I suppose, but in terms of story, characterization, and everything else, it's just so poor, and that's why I have to put it in 11th place. Right, so into 10th place now, and I am going to go with Solo, A Star Wars Story. So this is one of the 2 anthology films. This one follows a young Han Solo on his early adventures, and yeah, for me, the biggest problem I have with this film is that this is just a film I wasn't really asking for. And, even though I'm a big Star Wars fan, it took me a good few years to actually get around to watching this film because I just had no interest in it. And I just don't think we really need to know about Han Solo's backstory. And I think the actual film itself, the plot, it doesn't really hold my interest. This film is too long, it's too slow. It doesn't really have that many great moments in it, and it just kind of plods along. I forget the guy's name who plays Han Solo, but he's fine in the role, but it doesn't feel like Han Solo. It just kind of feels like we're watching a different character, and he just happens to have the same name as the original Han Solo. So yeah, for me, I've only ever watched it the one time, and yeah, I can barely remember anything about it. It's not quite as messy or as all over the place as Rise of Skywalker, but I just find this film very bland and very forgettable. So that's why I have to put it into 10th place. Right, so into 9th place now, and I am going to go with Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. Now, on the whole, I don't really mind the prequels. You'll hear more about the other 2 films later in this video. But for me, Attack of the Clones is the only one out of the prequel trilogy that I do kind of struggle with. I don't find the story very engaging with this one. I think the film itself is way too long. It's a bit of a slog to get through. There's large portions of the film that are just really slow. The romance between Anakin and Padme is just non-existent, and I just don't think they have much chemistry. And a lot of the action scenes are just very like they're very overly cartoonish, and I just think they lack a lot of tension. The film itself does have some decent moments. I do kind of like the more sort of mystery elements introduced in this one. I like the fact that Obi-Wan is kind of like a secret agent in places, and I think a lot of the scenes with him are amongst the best. I like that we get a lot of newer alien species and new planets, new locations. You know, say what you want about George Lucas, but he was always good of, you know, coming up with new ways to expand the universe of Star Wars. So I do like the film for those sort of aspects. But yeah, like I said, on the whole, I just find this film a little bit slow, a little bit boring, and yeah, it just lacks that sort of that tension that I want from a Star Wars film. So that's why I have to put it into 9th place. Right, so into 8th place now, and I'm going to go with Rogue One, A Star Wars Story. So yeah, this might be a surprise to some people, because I know there are people out there who think this is one of the best Star Wars films, and certainly one of the best of the more recent films. But for me, I have the same problem with this film as I do with the Han Solo film, and that is that I just never felt like I needed this film, and it just feels very unnecessary. You know, you can do a Star Wars anthology film, and it could literally be about anything. There's a wealth of things you could do. The universe is massive, and to me, it just feels a bit lazy to do a film about a story that, you know, we already know. And because of that, the film just lacks stakes and it lacks tension. You know, we know how this film's going to end, and whenever I sit through this film, I just find it very, very bland. I think a lot of the characters are not that interesting. I think the film is very slow and overlong in places. It does have some nice moments. It's directed fairly well. It's got some good action scenes, but ultimately it just feels more like a piece of fan service than anything else. Did we really need to see Darth Vader in this film? Did we really need to see Princess Leia, Grand Moff Tarkin, you know, all those characters? It just feels more like a piece of fan service more than anything else. And ultimately, I just think the film is very unnecessary and kind of forgettable. So yeah, for that reason, I have to put it into 8th place. Right, so into 7th place now, and I'm going to go with Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi. So yeah, I have already briefly touched on this film, and yeah, I think it's fair to say that this film is probably the most controversial film in the entire series of Star Wars films. And I will admit myself, the first time I saw this film, I hated it. I hated this movie the first time I saw it. You know, as a fan, this film kind of hurt me on a personal level. But I will say that on a rewatch, even though I still don't think this film is great, it has improved for me. I know this film, like I said, is very radical, very different, and I actually kind of applaud the producers and the director for actually having the balls to do some of the things they did with this movie, and, you know, kind of going out of the fans' comfort zone and trying to do something very different. I think ultimately it maybe strays a bit too far into that sort of that radical zone. You know, some of the things they do with the characters like Luke and Leia, you know, those long-time characters. Yeah, I just don't really agree with that as a fan. And the story itself can plod along and be a bit boring at times. But I will say that this is probably one of the best looking Star Wars films ever. It has some very, very good action scenes. And ultimately, I don't think it's as bad as I once thought it did. I still don't think it's a great film, and ultimately it does always leave a sour taste in my mouth whenever I watch it, but it's nowhere near as bad as Rise of Skywalker for me, and I do kind of applaud it for being a bit different, but yeah, it's probably just that little bit too different for my taste, and I'm sure for a lot of other people's. But yeah, that is The Last Jedi in 7th place. Right, so into 6th place now, and I am going to go with Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens. So yeah, this was the first film in the new sequel trilogy, and yeah, I can remember the hype for this movie when it came out. I was so excited for it. When I finally saw it, I did enjoy it, but I was kind of underwhelmed by it, and I still feel the same about it now. For me, this movie is just fine. It's fine. It's not one of the best. It's not one of the worst. It just falls very much in the middle for me. I do like the fact that, you know, it kind of harkens back to those classic Star Wars films that feels a bit more practical. It's a fun adventure film. We get to see some of the old characters back, but like I said before about the character of Rey, I just feel like the film concentrates too much on her, and I just don't think she's an interesting character. Like I said before, she's just like Luke Skywalker all over again. You know, she has the same backstory, she has the same character progression, and ultimately, I just think they should have done something different with the character. But then you also have the character of Finn, who's like the rogue stormtrooper. And I actually think that this film should have concentrated more on him. In fact, I think the whole sequel trilogy should have concentrated more on him, because I think his character's story would have given a much more interesting dynamic, and it would have been something different. And I think they kind of missed the mark with that. But I guess the biggest problem this film has is that ultimately it just feels very redundant. When it first came out and it was the only one in the sequel trilogy, I thought it was pretty decent. But since we've had the other two films and they got progressively worse, this film just feels very redundant. So whenever I watch it, I always kind of feel a bit disappointed knowing where the direction of this trilogy is going to go, because ultimately this film sets up a lot of questions and we just never got the answers to them in the following films. And yeah, like I said, I think the film is just fine. It's okay. It's not a bad film, but it's not one of the best either. So yeah, that is The Force Awakens in 6th place. Right, so into 5th place now, and I'm going to go with Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. So yeah, this one might be a surprise to some people, because I know this film is often considered to be one of the worst in the series, but I was 8 years old when this film came out, and I remember seeing it in the cinema. I remember being so hyped for it, and I loved it. And I think to this day, I've always had a bit of love for this film. It wasn't really until I got older that I started to understand the reputation that it had and the hatred that it had. But I do feel like in the last few years, especially with the sequels coming out, I think people look back on this film and the prequels in general, and I think it's starting to get a bit more appreciation. And yeah, I actually think this film is probably the most underrated in the series. I'm not going to say it's a perfect film. It does definitely have its issues. I think, the plot about the whole trade negotiations is a bit boring for a Star Wars film. Some of the performances are a bit wooden. Some of the dialogue is not that great. And the first half of the film in particular is quite slow. But once you get into the second half, I do think it really picks up. And, especially the sort of the finale, like the action in the finale is just amazing. You've got a great villain with Darth Maul. It's just a shame he is a bit underused in this film. And I feel like he should have been in like maybe more of the prequels. But overall, I think this is a fun Star Wars adventure, and it feels very close to those original films because it does still use practical locations, practical effects. It doesn't quite go into the CGI heavy realm that the other two prequels do. And yet, for those reasons, I do think it is a pretty good film. And like I said, very underrated. I can understand the flaws with it. It's nowhere near one of the best Star Wars films, but I think you could do far worse than this film. So yeah, that is The Phantom Menace in 5th place. Right, so into 4th place now, and I'm going to go with Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. So yeah, just to go back to when this first came out, I was 14 years old, and I was so excited that we were finally getting that final piece of the puzzle of the initial 6-film saga. It was such an exciting time when this film came out. And ultimately, I do think this film delivers. I think it is by far the best of the 3 prequels. And I really enjoy the story with this one. I like the darker, more emotional turn that the story takes. It's got some amazing action scenes, especially in that second half. Great music by John Williams. I mean, I should mention him. His music is great in all the Star Wars films, but I think in the prequels it definitely excels. And overall, I just think this is a real, great film, and I just love that darker, emotional turn that it takes. I'm not going to sit here and say that the film's perfect. I think even when I saw it back when it came out, there are aspects of it that I do feel are a little bit rushed. I think Anakin's turn to the dark side just kind of happens a bit too quickly for me, especially when he gets put in the Darth Vader suit. It just kind of happens within the last 5 minutes of the film, and it does just feel a little bit rushed. So I feel like, just some tighter writing in there, probably would have helped the film a little bit. Some of the acting is a little bit wooden still, and some of the dialogue is not that great, especially between Padme and Anakin. But these are just very minor gripes for me, because on the whole, I just think this is a fantastic film, the best one of the prequels for me. And yeah, it falls into fourth place. Right, so into third place now, and I am going to go with Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, or otherwise known as Star Wars The Original. And yeah, I'm just going to say that I love all three of the original films in that original trilogy. If you haven't guessed already, they do form my top three, but one of them does have to come in third place, and I would say out of the three of them, A New Hope is probably my least favourite, but I still love this film. I just think maybe for me, it's just not as epic, it's not as big in scope as the other two films. Maybe the characters aren't quite fully developed, and it does feel a bit light, like light-hearted in comparison to the other two. But it's still such a fantastic space adventure, iconic part of pop culture, and yeah, there's very few faults I can give this film. Like I said, maybe it just doesn't quite have the budget of the other two in the original trilogy. Even Darth Vader himself doesn't feel quite as intimidating in this film as he would do in the next two. But yeah, these are just very minor gripes, because on the whole, I love this movie. But out of the three in the original trilogy, one has to come in third place. And for me, it is A New Hope. Right, so into second place now, and I am going to go with Star Wars Episode 6, Return of the Jedi. So yeah, this is an interesting one for me, because I often hear a lot of people say that out of the original trilogy, this one seems to be considered the worst. And I can maybe understand that, but for me, I love it, and it's only just pipped to the number one spot. I think this is how you do a third chapter in a trilogy. This film is like the perfect template for it. You have the ultimate evil finally showing his face in this film after being teased in the previous two. You have our main protagonist having to come to terms with who he is and having to face his biggest fears. And it's just an epic conclusion to the story that's been built up over three films. And ultimately, I just think it is a very satisfying conclusion. I love all of the moments in this film, you know, from the beginning scenes at Jabba the Hutt's place to the final scenes on Endor. You know, I know some people don't really like the Ewoks. They don't bother me really. And I just think a lot of the action scenes, the space battles, the lightsaber duel at the end between Luke and Darth Vader, it's just fantastic, very emotional stuff. And yeah, like I said, it's just a perfect way to close out a trilogy for me. And yeah, I have to put Return of the Jedi into second place. Right, so we have made it to the number one spot, and if you haven't guessed already, it is, of course, Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. And yeah, I don't think many Star Wars fans are going to argue with this one, because I know this one is often considered to be the best one in the series, and it's even considered to be one of the greatest films of all time, and it's definitely in my top 10. I can remember when I was a kid and I just had the original trilogy of Star Wars films, this was always the one I rewatched the most. I don't know why, because it's clearly the darkest film of the three, but even as a kid, I always knew there was something special about this film. I think once you go from A New Hope to this film, it just feels like the story starts to become a lot more serious, the characters are a lot more fleshed out, and it just takes a much more emotional, darker turn, and it becomes so much more engaging. Like I said before about Return of the Jedi being the perfect way to close a trilogy, this feels like the perfect way to be the middle chapter of a trilogy. I often compare this film to Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, because I think the template of that film is very similar to this one. You know, all of our characters are split up. It's a very much darker film. It doesn't really have much of an ending. It's kind of a darker ending. The villains essentially win at the end of this movie. And it's just a fantastic way to be the middle chapter of a trilogy. And like I said before about Darth Vader not feeling that intimidating in A New Hope, in this one, he feels like a real villain in this one. This is where he becomes the real deal. And there's just so many great moments in this film, some great scenes on the Battle of Hoth at the beginning. And we also have the fantastic lightsaber duel at the end between Luke and Darth Vader. There's a lot of great lightsaber duels throughout the entire series of films, but none of them come close to the lightsaber duel in this film. I know that the lightsaber duel in this one is maybe not the most choreographed, but it's just so story driven because we have Luke, who's clearly the lesser of the two fighters. He's very vulnerable and he's up against Darth Vader, who is clearly a much better fighter. And we, as the audience, we know that Luke is the inferior fighter, and we just kind of wonder, how is he going to get out of this? How is he going to defeat him? And it just makes it such an engaging film, so story driven, and the characterization is just so strong. And yeah, I can't really fault this movie. It's perfect. I don't really have any faults for it. It's my favorite Star Wars film, and yeah, it falls into first place. Right, so there you go, guys. That is my ranking for all of the live action Star Wars films. Really hope you've enjoyed seeing this ranking. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think of this ranking? What would be your own ranking of the Star Wars films? Are you a Star Wars fan? Are you not? I would love to hear your thoughts. So thank you so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you all again on the next one. So take care, guys.